2 months gone, and I come home to find strangers splashing in my lake like it's theirs. I couldn't even catch my breath. The sand wasn't mine. The pavilions weren't mine. But somehow my name was everywhere, signed, stamped, praising me for a gift I never gave. Everyone acted like I was some kind of saint who sacrificed everything while I just stood there with a walker, exhausted, disoriented, wondering if I was losing my mind or being set up for something worse. Let me know in the comments. Do you think this was a mistake or something darker waiting behind the curtain? The first thing you need to understand about me is that I bought this house specifically because nobody else wanted it. Rick Dawson, 39 years old. Former military veteran who just wanted to disappear from the world after spending 8 years getting shot at overseas. The property sat at the end of a dead-end road with a natural lake that previous owners couldn't afford. To maintain properly, my daughter Maya, who's 10 years old, was the only person I actually wanted around. The kayak accident that put me in the hospital happened because I was doing what I always did when civilian life felt overwhelming. Paddling out into the middle of my lake at midnight. Waking up from a medical coma after 2 months feels like somebody hit the fast-forward button on your entire existence. Maya had been staying with my sister during my recovery, and they wheeled me out to the discharge area where my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was waiting with her sedan since my truck had been totaled. I was still using mobility equipment and had new eyewear for the vision problems that come with head trauma. The massive wooden marker hit me first because it was impossible to miss. Planted right next to my mailbox like some kind of monument. Sunset Shores Community Beach Sustainable Development Initiative. Thank you, Rick Dawson, for your lake donation. Opening summer 2024. Mrs. Patterson pulled into my driveway and started talking about how wonderful it was that I decided to share my property with everyone. I honestly couldn't process her words because my brain was still trying to make sense of the visual chaos. This professional carved lettering and metal plaque featured what looked exactly like my signature underneath an official seal.
Ow.
I sat staring at my own name endorsing something, at zero recollection of approving. Mrs. Patterson helped me out of the car, and I grabbed my mobility aid, expecting to see my familiar backyard wear. I used to sit watching Maya feed ducks. Instead, I found myself looking at a professionally designed recreational facility that had somehow materialized behind my house while I was unconscious. There was imported white sand covering about half an acre of natural shoreline with wooden walkways connecting pavilions that definitely hadn't existed 2 months ago. Beach chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing the water, and there was sports equipment stretched between 2 poles. The whole setup looked like a vacation rental property, complete with a sound system and a wooden pier extending into deeper water. But the detail that really made me question my sanity was the fact that people were actually using all of this infrastructure like it belonged to them. I counted at least 15 adults and maybe twice as many kids scattered across my backyard recreational area, some playing sports, others lounging in furniture they brought from their own houses. There were coolers and umbrellas and inflatable toys scattered around like this was a normal Tuesday afternoon, a public recreation center. A group of teenagers had claimed the biggest pavilion for what looked like a graduation party, complete. With balloons and cake, while their parents sat in beach chairs taking photos, the whole scene felt so surreal that I wondered if the head injury had left me hallucinating. Mrs. Patterson must have noticed me standing there with my mouth hanging open because she patted my shoulder and started explaining how the whole community had come together to make my vision a reality while I was covering. She talked about permits and construction crews and how everyone was so inspired by my generosity in sharing such a beautiful natural resource with families. I wanted to interrupt her and explain that I'd never had any such vision, but a woman with a clipboard was already walking toward us with a huge smile. She introduced herself as Linda Barton, the Homeowners Association president. Naya started thanking me for being such an inspiration to the entire community during my recovery process. Linda had this way of talking that made it impossible to get a word in edgewise. The conversation kept getting stranger, because Linda kept referencing conversations and decisions that I had zero recollection of making. She mentioned how I had specifically requested that the recreational area include amenities for families with young children, and how I'd insisted on using environmentally sustainable materials for all the construction projects. Linda claimed I'd even provided detailed specifications for the pavilion designs and had personally approved the imported sand that now covered half of my shoreline. Every detail she mentioned sounded reasonable and thoughtful, the kind of thing a generous property owner might actually request. The problem was that Rick Dawson, the actual person standing there listening to her talk, had never made any of these decisions and certainly never signed any documents. The strangest part was how genuinely grateful Linda seemed, like she was talking to someone who'd made a significant personal sacrifice for the greater good. She kept using phrases like "your incredible generosity" and "such a selfless gift," while gesturing toward the recreational setup that had apparently been built with my permission and financial contribution. Linda's version of events suggested I'd not only donated the use of my lake, but it also helped fund the construction costs because I believed so strongly in providing recreational opportunities. The way she talked made it sound like I was some kind of community hero who'd overcome personal tragedy to create something beautiful for everyone. I wanted to tell her that she was confusing me with somebody else, but I was starting to wonder if the head trauma had erased major decisions. A little girl with pigtails ran up to us carrying a sand bucket and started thanking me for building such a cool playground in my backyard. She said her mom had told her that Mr. Rick was the nicest man in the whole neighborhood because he let everyone use his lake heaven, though he didn't have to share it. Behind her, I could see adults setting up what looked like a barbecue station near one of the pavilions, while kids played in the shallow water where I used to keep my fishing boat anchored. The whole scene felt like I was watching someone else's life through a window. Except somehow, I was supposed to be the main character in a story I didn't remember agreeing to participate in. But standing there listening to everyone thank me for something I'd never agreed to do, watching strangers use my property like they owned it, I felt this cold sensation creeping over me. This wasn't just about unauthorized construction or trespassing on my land. Everyone kept talking about my generous donation, my selfless decision, my inspiring transformation, but I hadn't donated anything, I hadn't made any decisions, and I definitely hadn't been transformed into some kind of community saint while I was unconscious in that hospital bed. So if I hadn't agreed Tony of this, who exactly had been making decisions in my name for the past 2 months, standing there watching my daughter's excitement about strangers partying in our backyard, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Someone had been living my life while I was fighting for it. The next morning brought Linda's phone call, inviting me to what she described as a celebration ceremony honoring the completion of the Sunset Shores Community Beach project. She explained they had been orchestrating this event for weeks, timing it perfectly with my hospital discharge so the community could properly express their gratitude. I tried explaining that I was still recovering and wasn't ready for public events, but she insisted my presence was essential since I was the guest of honor. Linda mentioned several local officials were planning to attend, along with representatives from environmental sustainability councils and a news crew from the local television station. The ceremony was staged on the recreational area behind my house, with a small platform positioned near the largest pavilion and folding chairs arranged in neat rows across the imported sand. By the time I arrived with my mobility aid, there were already close to 100 people gathered, many of them families I'd never encountered, but who apparently lived somewhere in the sprawling subdivision that surrounded my property. Linda greeted me at the entrance to what used to be my backyard and immediately started steering me toward the front row, introducing me to various officials and community leaders who wanted to shake my hand. Everyone kept using phrases like local hero and inspiring example while patting my shoulder and expressing their appreciation for my selfless contribution to the neighborhood. The level of organization was staggering, like they'd hired an actual event planning company rather than throwing together a casual neighborhood gathering. There was professional sound equipment with microphones and speakers, and even a banner stretched between two poles that read, "Thank you, Rick Dawson, for your service to our community." Someone had clearly invested serious money and time preparing for this celebration, which made me wonder how long they had been planning to honor my supposed generosity. The whole setup felt more like a political rally than a simple thank you gathering, complete with official-looking podium and professional photography equipment. When Linda took the platform to begin the ceremony, she started by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate what's called Rick's vision, a phrase that made me uncomfortable because I'd never possessed any such vision. She talked about my background as a military veteran and how my sense of service had naturally extended to serving my civilian community through this generous donation of valuable lakefront property. Linda's speech suggested my willingness to share my most treasured possession with families who couldn't afford lake vacations, demonstrated the kind of leadership and generosity that made our neighborhood such a special place to live. Responded with enthusiastic applause while I sat in my front row seat, feeling like I was listening to someone describe a completely different person. Then Linda announced they'd prepared a special video presentation featuring some of my own words about the importance of community sharing and environmental stewardship. A large screen descended from a framework they had apparently constructed specifically for this event. And suddenly, I was watching what appeared to be footage of myself speaking passionately about the selfishness of keeping natural resources private when they could benefit so many families. The video showed me standing in various locations around my property, gesturing toward the lake while speaking eloquently about sustainability and social responsibility. But here's what made my spine freeze with terror. These clips came from interviews I'd given years ago during my military service. Someone had taken my old military interviews and carefully edited them, cutting and splicing my words to create entirely new sentences about lake sharing and community development. They had removed the original context completely, so that a comment I'd made about serving something bigger than yourself, in reference to military service, now appeared to be about donating property to neighbors. A statement about making sacrifices for the greater good that had originally been about soldiers protecting civilians was now being presented as my philosophy about sharing natural resources. The editing was so skillful that unless you knew the original source material, you'd never suspect these weren't my genuine thoughts about community property sharing. But I knew exactly where every clip had originated. The video concluded with what appeared to be recent footage of me looking directly into the camera and saying, "A lake kept for oneself is pure selfishness, but a lake shared with neighbors becomes a source of joy for generations." The crowd erupted in applause at this profound quote, while I sat there trying to figure out how they'd managed to create such convincing footage of me saying something I'd never uttered. The person in the video looked exactly like me, sounded exactly like me, and was even wearing clothes from my own closet, but I had zero recollection of recording such a statement. And given that I'd been unconscious for 2 months, I couldn't understand how such recent footage even existed. After the video presentation ended, Linda invited me to the podium to address the crowd and share my thoughts about seeing the project completed. I walked up to the microphone on unsteady legs, still processing what I just witnessed, and looked out at a sea of expectant faces waiting to hear from their community hero. I opened my mouth to explain that there had been some kind of terrible misunderstanding, that I'd never agreed to any lake-sharing project and had no memory of the conversations and decisions everyone kept referencing. But before I could speak, a man in the third row stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the ground, and shouted, "Rick Dawson is the kind of hero this country needs more of." The crowd burst into wild applause and cheering, with people jumping to their feet and clapping so loudly I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I tried to wave my hands to quiet them down, leaning closer to the microphone to explain that I wasn't any kind of hero and that there had been a serious mistake about my involvement in the beach project. But a woman near the front started chanting, "Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick." And within seconds, half the crowd had joined in, their voices drowning out anything I might have tried to say. Linda stood at the side of the platform with a huge smile on her face, nodding encouragingly, as if this overwhelming response was exactly what she'd expected. 2 security volunteers in matching polo shirts moved closer to the platform, positioning themselves between me and the crowd in what they probably thought was protective position. When I tried to step away from the podium to escape the chaos, one of them gently but firmly placed his hand on my arm and guided me back toward the microphone. He leaned in and said something about how the community needed to hear from me, how important this moment was for everyone who had supported the project. But his grip on my arm felt less like assistance and more like restraint, making it clear that leaving the platform wasn't really an option. I tried again to speak into the microphone, raising my voice to cut through the continuing applause and chanting, But just as I began to say, "There's been a mistake," a hostile voice from somewhere in the back shouted, "Why are you trying to ruin this for everyone?" The question caught me off guard, and suddenly the cheering died down as people turned to see who had spoken. An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering while everyone stared at me, waiting for my response to what sounded like an accusation rather than a question. The security volunteer's grip on my arm tightened slightly, and I noticed that somehow I had become the problem rather than the victim. But as I opened my mouth to try one more time to explain the truth, the crowd suddenly erupted in cheers again. Drowning out my voice with thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever, I stood there silenced, watching strangers celebrate a version of me that had never existed. While somewhere in that crowd, the real architects of this deception were approbably smiling at how perfectly their plan was working. That night, I finally cracked open the folder Linda had given me, and what I discovered inside made my stomach plummet like a stone thrown into deep water. The first document bore the title Temporary Usage Donation Agreement, and it was dated 3 weeks before my accident, which should have been impossible since I remembered that entire period with crystal clarity. This paperwork claimed I had voluntarily agreed to allow the Homeowners Association to develop recreational asset on my lakefront property for a period of 5 years with an option to extend if both parties agreed. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine, complete with the little flourish I always add to the letter D in Dawson. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed any such document. My hands began shaking as I flipped through page after page of documents, each one bearing what appeared to be my authentic signature, authorizing various aspects of the beach development project. I slammed the down on my kitchen table with such force that my coffee mug jumped and spilled across the surface, the hot liquid spreading toward the documents like it was trying to wash away the evidence. My chair scraped loudly against the floor as I pushed back from the table, pulse racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. Someone had not only forged my signature with incredible precision, but had also constructed an entire fictional timeline showing months of planning. The paperwork suggested I had been actively involved in every aspect of the project, from choosing the type of sand to approving the pavilion designs, even agreeing to contribute $15,000 toward construction costs. Each signature was flawless, capturing not just the shape of my handwriting, but also the specific pressure patterns and pen strokes that made my signature unique. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow suffered more severe brain damage than the doctors had told me, and was simply unable to remember making these agreements. But I knew these decisions were completely inconsistent with everything I valued about privacy and solitude after my military service. I called my old lawyer, Jim Morrison, first thing the next morning and explained what I discovered. He agreed to meet me at his office that afternoon to examine the documents and figure out what legal options I might have for challenging what appeared to be a sophisticated fraud operation. Jim had handled my house purchase 3 years earlier and had always been straight with me about legal matters, so I trusted him to give me an honest assessment of my situation. When I spread the paperwork across his desk, he spent almost an hour examining every signature before finally looking up at me, rubbing his temples like he was developing a migraine from what he was seeing. Jim avoided making direct eye contact, as he explained that the signatures were so convincing that proving they were forgeries would require expensive handwriting, analysis, and possibly months of legal proceedings. If proved that documents were fraudulent, the Homeowners Association could argue that they had relied on what appeared to be legitimate paperwork. When they invested tens of thousands of dollars in developing my property, he warned me that if I fought this publicly, some people might think I was fabricating the whole story to escape responsibility for promises I'd actually made. The way he said it made me suspect that even my own lawyer was starting to doubt my version of events. Jim's research revealed that everything was properly notarized and filed with the appropriate government offices, making it look like legitimate transactions that would be incredibly complicated and expensive to challenge. He estimated that fighting the agreement would cost at least $20,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee that we'd be successful in court. But the most disturbing discovery came when Jim researched the property records at the county courthouse. The paperwork showed that I had supposedly appeared in person at the county clerk's office to file the agreement, complete with a photocopy of my driver's license and a sworn statement that I was acting voluntarily and without coercion. That evening, Maya came over for dinner for the first time since I'd gotten out of the hospital, and seeing her reaction to the beach development broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. She was absolutely thrilled by the transformation of our backyard, running around, showing me all the cool features like the sports equipment and the wooden pier where she could fish without needing a boat. She talked excitedly about inviting her friends over for beach parties, and asked if we could get some of those colorful beach chairs she'd seen other families using during their visits to our lake. Maya kept thanking me for being so generous and sharing our special place with other kids who didn't have lakes in their backyards. The situation became even more heartbreaking when Mia mentioned she had apparently been telling everyone at school about their dad's amazing gift to the community and had even written a report about environmental stewardship that featured our lake. As an example of responsible resource sharing, according to my sister, Maya had been incredibly proud during my recovery period, bragging to her classmates about how her father was making it possible for dozens of families to enjoy lake activities without having to drive hours to find public beaches. She had apparently become something of a celebrity among her friends, all of whom wanted to come over and experience the awesome beach that her generous dad had created. Sitting on my deck that night, watching Maya play in the shallow water with some kids whose parents had brought them over for an evening swim, I started to question whether this was just about property rights anymore. These families genuinely believed that I had made a conscious choice to share something precious with them. And they were treating my property with respect and gratitude because they thought I wanted them there. The kids were having so much fun, and their parents were so appreciative of what they believed was my generosity that I started to wonder if I was being selfish by wanting to take it all away from them. But then I remembered that someone had stolen my identity, forged my signature, and made financial commitments in my name without my consent. Someone had systematically created a fictional version of me that supported their agenda, using my face and voice and reputation to justify taking control of my most valuable asset. Even if the end result made people happy, the process had been built on fraud and deception, which meant that every moment of joy these families experienced at my lake was based on a lie. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether I should challenge the fake agreement, but rather how many other decisions the fictional Rick Dawson had supposedly made while I was unconscious. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the forged signature that looked exactly like my own handwriting, down to every curve and flourish that made it uniquely mine. The documents were so professionally executed that anyone examining them would conclude they were authentic, which meant the forger had either practiced my signature hundreds of times or had access to sophisticated technology I didn't understand. Either way, someone had invested serious time and resources in stealing my identity and my property rights. As I traced my finger over the fake signature, a terrible thought occurred to me. If they could forge documents this convincing while was conscious and living my normal life, what else might they have accomplished during the 2 months I was unconscious and completely defenseless? The next morning, I searched my own name online. Maya tugged my arm as I scrolled through results, pulse racing. Someone had created social media accounts in my name across multiple platforms. Photos of me with posts about minimalist living, environmental responsibility, sharing natural resources. The online Rick Dawson was a philosophical guru who shared profound thoughts about property ownership and community. Service complete with inspiring quotes and sustainability articles. This fake version had thousands of followers commenting with admiration for my wisdom and generosity. People nationwide were inspired by my supposed lake-sharing decision, using my story as an example of modern community spirit. Discussion threads analyzed my quotes about selfishness, debating my philosophy's deeper meaning. Reading these conversations felt like watching strangers discuss a fictional character wearing my face. The fake persona's consistency made it believable. Online, Rick possessed clear values aligning perfectly with someone who donates lake usage. He posted about moving beyond material possessions, joy from helping others, environmental benefits of shared resources. His writing style was thoughtful and articulate. Nothing like my actual communication, but plausible to anyone not knowing me personally. Whoever created this identity had spent months developing a coherent character supporting their property. Plans, posts dated back almost a year. Someone built this fake version long before my accident gave them implementation opportunity. I recognized surveillance photos taken without my knowledge during grocery and hardware store trips. Someone watched me, photographed me, documented activities to create convincing online presence supporting their transformation story. Months of unknown surveillance felt violating beyond property theft. The chilling discovery came finding posts. Made during my hospital time while unconscious and fighting for life, Maya asked questions I couldn't answer. Too shocked seeing posts supposedly written during my coma. Fake Rick shared recovery updates, expressed community support, gratitude. Reaffirmed Lake Project commitment despite medical challenges. 1. Post 2 weeks after my accident read, even from this hospital bed, I'm more convinced than ever that sharing our blessings with others is what gives life meaning. Can't wait to see the beach project completed. When I tried accessing these accounts to delete them or post corrections, I was locked out completely. Passwords changed. Recovery emails linked to accounts I'd never created. Someone had stolen my identity and ensured I couldn't reclaim my own online presence. Fake Rick had become more real than actual Rick on the internet. Nothing I could do without lengthy legal processes. That afternoon, I visited neighbors investigating how this scheme developed. First stop was Mrs. Patterson's house next door. When I asked about the lake project, invited me for coffee, and immediately gushed about my transformation into a community-minded person. They claimed I'd personally visited months before my accident to explain my beach vision and ask for support. Bob pulled out a folder with notes from our supposed conversation, complete with diagrams I'd apparently drawn showing pavilion and sports equipment positioning. Handwriting looked exactly like mine. Diagrams detailed enough, suggesting consider. Thought went into beach design. Bob's notes claimed I'd specifically mentioned sharing the lake was something I'd considered for years. But my accident helped me grasp what was truly important. He showed me a business card I'd supposedly given him, featuring my name and phone number with the title Community Development Consultant, a profession I'd never claimed and a business I'd never operated. Mrs. Patterson was impressed by my presentation and had recommended me to their neighbors interested in sustainable resource sharing. She said I'd spent hours walking around the neighborhood talking to families about community ownership philosophy, encouraging them to think beyond traditional private property concepts. She claimed I'd been passionate about environmental benefits of shared lake usage, explaining how multiple families using one lake was more efficient than everyone finding separate waterfront property. She remembered me saying, keeping such beautiful natural resources to myself was essentially selfish. Walking home, I understood Fake Rick hadn't just existed online and in legal documents. He'd been walking my neighborhood for months, visiting neighbors personally, building beach project support through face-to-face conversations. I had zero recollection of having someone looking like me, sounding like me, knowing enough about my background to seem credible. Had systematically laid groundwork for taking over my property. Planning and deception level was so sophisticated, it seemed impossible for an individual to orchestrate. I wondered if I was dealing with something much larger and more organized. But as I reached my front door, Maya ran up with tears in her eyes, asking if what people were saying online was true about Daddy having a fake life. It wasn't really him. I found a post supposedly made by me during the coma with thousands of likes and froze. The timestamp showed it had been posted at 3:15 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly when the hospitalig showed I was having emergency surgery to reduce brain swelling. I spent days trying to prove the online accounts were fake, but every lead hit another dead end. Then Maya changed everything without understanding it. She was working on a school project about local heroes and decided to make a video about her dad's generous lake donation. Simple stuff. Just a 10-year-old girl standing on our deck, explaining why she was proud of what I had supposedly accomplished. Maya talked about how Mr. Rick Dawson had transformed from someone who preferred privacy into someone who understood community sharing. Her honesty made the video powerful, but she included details that would destroy their entire narrative. Mentioned how surprised she'd been by my decision to share the lake, since I had always valued quiet after military service. She talked about how I used to get anxious around crowds and had specifically chosen our isolated house to avoid neighborhood social scenes. These personal insights, which Mia thought made my supposed transformation more remarkable, actually proved the generous community leader was completely inconsistent with my real personality. Maya posted her video on the school platform, and within hours it was shared by teachers and parents. The video spread beyond our community as people saw it as inspiring proof that personal tragedy can lead to positive change. The breakthrough came when someone shared Maya's video in a forum dedicated to analyzing authentic versus manufactured viral content. A digital media expert pointed out that Maya's description of my personality changes seemed inconsistent with the timeline from my supposed social media accounts. According to fake online Rick, I had been developing community sharing philosophy gradually over months. But Maya's video suggested my decision was sudden and surprising to my own family. This discrepancy caught attention of other users who began examining the social media accounts more closely, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate fabricated content. Within 4 hours of Maya's video going viral, amateur internet detectives had uncovered evidence supporting the theory that my online presence was fake. They discovered metadata inconsistencies in photos suggesting manipulation before posting. They found writing style variations indicating multiple contributors to account content. Most significantly, they identified posts containing factual errors about my military service. Details the real Rick would never get wrong, but an impersonator might misunderstand or fabricate completely. A retired forensic analyst joined the investigation and applied professional techniques to examine digital evidence. She identified sophisticated photo manipulation in images supposedly showing me at community events I never attended. She found evidence of voice synthesis technology in audio clips posted as examples of my inspirational speaking style. Most damning, she discovered IP addresses associated with posting activity traced to locations I had never visited, including posts supposedly made from my hospital bed while unconscious. The technical evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of systematic identity theft far more sophisticated than anyone initially expected. As the online investigation continued, Maya became confused and upset by what people were saying about her father's supposed fake identity. She couldn't understand why anyone would question my community involvement, authenticity, since she had seen the beach development and witnessed genuine family gratitude. I tried explaining someone had been pretending to be me, making decisions without permission, but the concept was too complex and disturbing for her to grasp. She kept asking why anyone would pretend to be her dad, and whether all the nice things people said about our family were based on lies. Amia's teacher called about controversy surrounding her video project. Several parents had expressed concerns about whether Maya's family was experiencing identity crisis or mental health issues requiring school counselor intervention. The teacher was trying to be supportive, but her questions made clear the community was beginning to doubt not just my online presence authenticity, but also my actual family situation stability. Maya was caught in adult problems she couldn't understand, and I understood the deception had damaged more than just reputation and property rights. That evening, Maya and I sat on the deck watching families enjoy beach facilities built with my supposedly donated funds. I explained why we had to fight to prove none of this had been my idea. She listened carefully as I described how someone used my name and appearance to trick people into believing I supported beach development. Maya asked if that meant kids having fun at our beach would have to stop coming and whether parents would be angry at us for taking away something they thought had been a gift. Looking at my daughter's worried face as she processed our situation implications, I understood fake Rick had created consequences affecting innocent people, regardless of how truth eventually emerged. Families using our beach genuinely believed they had permission to be there, and their children had formed attachments to a place they thought had been generously shared. Even if I could prove donation was fraudulent, unwinding emotional and social relationships developed around the beach would cause pain for people who had done nothing wrong. The perpetrators had been clever enough to make themselves almost impossible to expose without hurting innocent victims. But watching Maya's expression change from confusion to determination, I understood she grasped something fundamental about our situation that I was only beginning to see myself. The truth was worth fighting for, even if it meant disappointing people who had believed in a lie. Maya looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said something that made my breath catch in my throat. "Daddy, if someone can steal who you are, while you're sleeping, does that mean they can steal who I am too?" Her question hung in the air between us, and I suddenly understood that this wasn't just about my property or my identity anymore. Maya was old enough to grasp that if someone could successfully impersonate her father for months without being detected, then identity itself was much more fragile than any of us wanted to believe. The next morning brought a development I should have anticipated. Linda Barton appeared at my front door with 2 other homeowners association board members, all wearing expressions, suggesting this wasn't a friendly social visit. Linda introduced Treasurer Margaret Walsh and Secretary David Chen, both familiar faces from the beach ceremony, but never spoken to directly before. They asked to come inside to discuss concerning developments related to my recent behavior and statements about the lake project. Their positioning on my porch made clear this was less request than demand. Through my front window, I could see neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, their silhouettes forming a crowd that seemed to be listening to whatever was about to happen and see my house. Once seated in my living room, Linda wasted no time getting to the point. She slammed a folder of papers onto my coffee table hard enough to make my lamp shake, the sound echoing through the room like a gavel striking wood. The Homeowners Association had become aware of online discussions, questioning my social media authenticity and community involvement, discussions sparked by Maya's video project. Linda claimed these conspiracy theories were causing distress among the community members who had invested time, money, and emotional energy in beach development based on trust in my stated commitment. She suggested my recent attempts to distance myself from lake donation were either medical complications from my accident or psychological reaction to recovery stress and community attention. Margaret Walsh pulled out what appeared to be medical records and waved them inches from my face, her voice rising as she explained traumatic brain injuries could cause personality changes, memory problems, and difficulty recognizing previously made commitments. Margaret claimed it was understandable I might be confused about events before my accident, especially since injuries had been severe enough to require extended unconsciousness. She suggested my current claims about never agreeing to lake donation were likely medical issues rather than intentional deception by community members trying to help. But then she produced another document that made my blood run cold, claiming a doctor had certified that I had memory loss severe enough to make me unfit to remember my own decisions. David Chen leaned forward aggressively while pointing at supposed financial commitments, his finger jabbing toward my face as he explained legal and financial implications of my apparent change of heart. He pointed out the Homeowners Association had invested over $30,000 in construction costs based on my signed agreement to donate lake usage rights, and dozens of families had made summer plans based on understanding the beach would be available for community use. David claimed my recent statements questioning project authenticity could be seen as attempting to back out of legally binding commitments, potentially exposing me to lawsuits from contractors, insurance companies, and community members who relied on my promises. Their presentation sounded reasonable and concerned, as if genuinely trying to help me understand why my recent behavior was confusing and potentially harmful to people who cared about me. Every time I tried to interrupt and explain that I had evidence proving the entire story was fabricated, one of them would cut me off with another reasonable sounding argument about why my perspective was unreliable or potentially harmful. Linda spoke about community pride in my transformation from reclusive veteran into inspiring example of service and generosity, and how disappointing it was seeing me apparently reject the identity that brought joy to local families. She mentioned specific examples of children learning to swim at our beach, elderly couples enjoying evening walks along shoreline, and teenagers organizing sports tournaments. Margaret added that my supposed philosophy about property sharing had inspired similar projects in other communities with several homeowners associations reaching out to learn about implementing their own resource-sharing initiatives. Margaret showed me articles from planning journals and sustainability websites, featuring my story as example of how individual generosity could create positive environmental and social impacts. Fake Rick had apparently become celebrity in certain professional Circles, meaning admitting the whole thing was fraudulent, would embarrass not just me, but experts who had praised my supposed vision. David shifted to more threatening tone, explaining that if I continued claiming my beach project involvement had been fabricated or unauthorized, I might face legal action from multiple parties who relied on my agreements in making decisions. He mentioned the construction company had bid on the project based on specifications I supposedly provided, and several families had turned down other vacation opportunities because they believed they would have beach access throughout summer. David's voice grew louder as he spoke about my signed legal agreements, creating obligations that couldn't be dismissed because of second thoughts or memory problems related to medical condition. His voice grew louder as he spoke, and I could hear the neighbors outside my window murmuring in response to what they were hearing. The conversation continued for almost an hour, with all 3 board members taking turns explaining why my current position was unreasonable and potentially illegal, their voices overlapping as they interrupted each other and me with increasing hostility. They offered to arrange meetings with medical professionals specializing in brain injury recovery, suggesting proper treatment might help me remember events and decisions I was currently denying. They also offered to modify usage agreement if I had concerns about specific beach development aspects, proposing compromises that might address my apparent community involvement anxiety while honoring commitments already made to local families. But every suggestion felt like a trap designed to make me admit that some version of their story was true. Throughout their presentation, kept waiting for opportunity to explain I had evidence proving the entire story was fabricated. But every time I tried speaking up, one would interrupt with another reasonable-sounding argument about why my perspective was unreliable or potentially harmful. They had clearly prepared for this conversation and anticipated every objection I might raise with responses making me sound either medically impaired or morally questionable for wanting to take away something bringing happiness to so many people. By the time they finished talking, I felt like I was being investigated for fraud rather than being victim of elaborate deception. The crowd of neighbors outside had grown larger, their shadows pressing closer to my windows. When they asked for my response, I told them I needed time to consider everything and consult with my attorney before making statements about beach project involvement. Linda nodded understandingly, saying that was reasonable, but mentioned the community would be watching how I handled this situation, and my reputation as trustworthy neighbor might depend on willingness to honor commitments made to families who had come to depend on my generosity. Margaret added, the homeowners association would meet the following week to discuss how to proceed if I continued claiming project participation had been unauthorized or fraudulent. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against my floor. As he gathered his papers, after they left, I grasped I was facing something much more sophisticated than simple identity theft or property fraud. These people had created such comprehensive and convincing version of my supposed community involvement that questioning it made me look like either a liar or someone with serious mental health problems. They had positioned themselves as reasonable parties trying to help confuse the accident victim while making me appear unreliable person, trying to back out of generous commitments for selfish reasons. Everything they said contained just enough truth to make their version of events seem plausible to anyone who didn't know the full story. The neighbors were still gathered outside, and I could see them looking toward my house with expressions that seemed more suspicious than supportive. But the terrifying truth was becoming clear. They didn't want the real Rick Dawson back. They preferred the fictional version they had created, and they were willing to fight to keep him alive, even if it meant destroying the actual person whose identity they had stolen. The fake Rick was more valuable to them than the real one, and they had built such a convincing case for his existence that proving he was fictional might be impossible. As Margaret gathered her papers to leave, she quietly warned that HOA would vote next week on whether to declare me legally incompetent to manage my property. That night I decided to take control of the narrative before the homeowners association could paint me as a delusional accident victim who couldn't be trusted to remember his own decisions. I set up a live stream from my deck using Mia's tablet with the beach development visible in the background, as evidence of what had been done to my property without my actual consent. Maya clutched my arm as the camera wobbled in my shaking hands. Viewers flooding in faster than I could count while notifications buzzed constantly across the screen. I started by introducing myself as the real Rick Dawson and explaining that I was about to tell the true story of how my identity had been stolen while I was fighting for my life. The contrast between my actual personality and the generous community leader everyone had been told about was immediately obvious to anyone watching the stream. Chat comments flashed across the screen faster than I could read them, with viewers immediately noting how different I seemed from the philosophical guru they'd seen in social media posts. I walked viewers through the timeline of deception, starting with the forged legal documents that supposedly proved I had donated lake usage rights to the community. My voice shook as I read the agreements aloud, showing copies of signatures that looked exactly like mine, but that I had never actually signed, explaining how someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create a convincing paperwork. Maya joined the live stream about halfway through, and her presence added a level of authenticity that no amount of technical evidence could have provided. She talked about how confused she had been by everyone's claims about her father's generous transformation. Since the Rick Dawson she knew had always been someone who valued privacy and quiet, Maya mentioned specific examples of my behavior that contradicted the community-minded persona that had been attributed to me, including my tendency to avoid neighborhood gatherings and my reluctance to engage in conversations with people I didn't know well. Her innocent observations provided powerful testimony that the generous lake donor was a fictional character rather than an accurate representation of her actual father. The live stream attracted thousands of viewers within its first hour, many of whom had been following the online investigation that had been triggered by Mass Original Video Project. Comments poured in from people who had experience with digital forensics, identity theft, and sophisticated fraud schemes, all of whom recognized the technical signatures of a professional deception operation. Several viewers with legal expertise pointed out that the level of document forgery and identity manipulation I was describing constituted serious felony charges that could result in significant prison sentences for anyone who had participated in the scheme. The consensus among knowledgeable commenters was that this was far too sophisticated to be the work of a single individual. As the live stream continued, viewers began sharing their own discoveries related to my case, creating a real-time collaborative investigation that produced evidence faster than I could have imagined possible. Expert voices joined the chat, offering to analyze evidence and provide professional opinions about what they were witnessing. Most significantly, a former law enforcement investigator recognized patterns in the deception that matched techniques used by professional identity theft rings that operated across multiple states and targeted individuals with valuable assets. Someone identified the specific software that had likely been used to create the voice synthesis samples, while another viewer posted links to companies that specialized in online reputation management for wealthy clients. The breakthrough moment came when a cybersecurity expert in the livestream chat identified metadata in one of my fake social media photos that revealed it had been processed by editing software registered to a computer with an IP address. Within minutes, other viewers had traced that address back to Linda Barton's home network, creating the smoking gun that connected the homeowners association president directly to the creation of the fraudulent online presence. As I read this discovery aloud, my breathing became uneven and the camera shook in my hands. But the chat erupted with excitement as viewers realized they were witnessing the real-time exposure of a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for months or possibly years. Just as I was reading the smoking gun IP address that tied Linda's home to the fake accounts, loud pounding erupted at my front door, the sound echoing through the house and clearly audible to the live stream audience. The camera wobbled as I turned toward the noise, and viewers in the chat immediately started speculating about who might be trying to interrupt the broadcast. Maya grabbed my arm tighter as the pounding continued, and I could see neighbors gathering on my front lawn through the window, their faces illuminated by porch lights and cell phone screens. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, as if someone had been monitoring the live stream and realized that damaging evidence was being revealed to thousands of people. Digital forensics specialists in the chat identified additional examples of photo manipulation and voice synthesis that demonstrated a coordinated effort to create convincing fake content over an extended period. Financial analysts traced money transfers that suggested the beach development had been funded through a complex scheme involving multiple bank accounts and shell companies controlled by homeowners association board members. Legal experts pointed out that the conspiracy appeared to involve mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of federal identity theft statutes that could result in decades of prison time for the perpetrators who had orchestrated this sophisticated criminal operation, targeting vulnerable property owners like myself. By the end of my 3-hour live stream, viewers had compiled enough evidence to fill a comprehensive criminal complaint that could be submitted to both state and federal law enforcement agencies. The collaborative investigation had not only proven that my identity had been stolen and my property rights violated, but it also uncovered what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal enterprise that may have targeted other victims in addition to me. Comments from viewers in other states mentioned similar cases involving homeowners, association schemes, and identity theft operations thought followed patterns remarkably similar to what had happened to me, suggesting that this might be part of a larger criminal network operating across multiple jurisdictions. The most satisfying moment of the entire evening came when someone in the live stream chat posted a link to Linda Barton's actual social media account, which had been made private but was still accessible through cached search engine results. The screenshots revealed that Linda had been documenting her involvement in the beach development project for months, including photos of herself meeting with contractors and inspecting construction progress on my property. Most damning of all were posts where Linda had explicitly discussed the financial benefits that the beach development would bring to property values in our neighborhood, revealing that her motivation had been profit rather than community service or environmental responsibility, as she had claimed. Maya stayed up past her bedtime to watch the final hour of the live stream. Seeing her excited expression as viewer after viewer validated our story gave me hope that we might actually be able to expose the truth and reclaim our property. She asked if all the evidence meant that people would finally believe we were telling the truth about never agreeing to share our lake, and whether the families who had been using the beach would understand that they had been misled rather than rejected by us. I told her that the truth was finally coming out, but that it might take time for everyone to process what they were learning. As I ended the live stream that night, I realized that Maya and I were no longer fighting this battle alone. Thousands of people had witnessed the evidence of our victimization and were ready to help, seek justice against the criminals who had stolen my identity. As I read the smoking gun IP address tied to Linda's home, the screen glitched, suggesting someone is actively trying to shut me down. The live stream attracted over 3 million viewers by the next morning, and the evidence compiled was making headlines. Across the country, legal experts called it one of the most sophisticated identity theft cases they had ever seen, while cybersecurity professionals analyzed the technical deception. Most importantly, the overwhelming documentation caught the attention of federal law enforcement agencies specializing in complex fraud schemes. Within 48 hours of my broadcast, FBI agents were contacting me about opening a formal investigation into what appeared to be a multi-state criminal enterprise operating for several years. FBI agents arrived 2 days later with search warrants for Linda Barton's residence and homeowners association offices, plus subpoenas for bank records and electronic communications related to the beach project. I watched from my deck as federal agents surrounded Linda's house, cameras flashing as neighbors gathered to witness the dramatic scene. Linda Barton was handcuffed during a community meeting at the local library, her face flushed with shock. As FBI agents read her rights while dozens of neighbors watched in stunned silence, Margaret Walsh and David Chen were also arrested on similar charges, along with 3 other individuals who had provided technical services for creating fake documents. Federal investigation moved faster than expected, with arrests beginning within a week. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered this wasn't Linda's first property theft through identity manipulation, with evidence of at least 6 other cases in different states where similar schemes had been used to control valuable real estate. Legal consequences were swift and severe once the full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear. Linda was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges. Margaret Walsh received 12 years in prison, while David Chin was sentenced to 8 years. Technical specialists who created fake documents received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. Financial recovery exceeded my lawyer's most optimistic projections as federal courts ordered comprehensive arrestation. The judgment included $75,000 in direct compensation for property damages, emotional distress, and legal expenses, with additional penalties bringing total recovery over $100,000. The Homeowners Association was forced to dissolve and liquidate all assets to pay court-ordered damages. Linda's personal assets, including her house and investment accounts, were seized to satisfy restitution orders, ensuring significant financial consequences, even after completing her prison sentence. But the most satisfying outcome was the complete restoration of my property rights and the unsettling of the fraudulent beach development that had been built without my consent. Federal marshals supervised the removal of all unauthorized structures, and I personally participated by ripping out the "Thank you, Rick Dawson, for your lake donation" sign with my own hands, tossing it to the ground with more satisfaction than I'd felt in months. I immediately planted a new sign that read "Rick's Lake," the real one, not the symbol. Contractors who had been deceived were compensated from the seized assets, ensuring that innocent parties didn't suffer financial losses. The community's reaction was mixed, with some neighbors gathering to apologize personally for having been deceived. Several families approached me with tears in their eyes, thanking me for handling the situation in a way that focused on the real criminals. However, I also faced criticism from community members who were angry about losing access to theed facilities. Some neighbors gathered outside my house shouting that I was selfish for taking away something that had brought so much joy to local families. 6 months after Linda's sentencing, I received a settlement check from a class action lawsuit filed against social media platforms that had allowed my identity to be stolen. Maya and I used part of the settlement money to build a treehouse overlooking our lake, creating a private space where we could enjoy our property without unwanted intrusion. I also decided to pan the lake to community use on scheduled weekends during summer, but under my terms and with proper legal agreements. The difference was that now people asked permission instead of assuming they had permanent rights to use my land. Standing on my deck one evening watching Maya fish from the pier we had rebuilt according to our own specifications, I reflected on how much our lives had changed since I first woke up from my coma to find strangers partying in my backyard. The fake Rick Dawson, who had supposedly donated my lake to the community, was gone forever, replaced by the real Rick Dawson, who had learned that fighting for truth and justice was worth any amount of temporary conflict. The wooden sign that now stood beside my driveway served as a permanent reminder that authentic identity couldn't be stolen, no matter how sophisticated the criminals. They had thought they could steal me while I slept, but it turned out I woke up just in time to steal myself back with interest. Maya asked if we were finally safe from people pretending to be us. All right. And I told her that we'd learned how to protect ourselves. The lake belonged to us again, and nobody could take that away. We had won completely, and the criminals were paying the price for years to come. But 3 weeks later, as I was rebuilding the last section of private fencing around our property, I found an unmarked envelope tucked under my mailbox. The letter inside was typed on plain paper. Linda's scheme was only one branch of a larger network. You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back, Rick Dawson. My fingers clenched around the page as if squeezing it hard enough could make the words disappear. But the warning burned through me. Someone had gone to prison. Someone had lost everything. Yet apparently that wasn't the end. I scanned the street, half expecting to see a car idling too long or a neighbor pretending not to watch me. Maya came running from the deck asking what I'd found. I slipped the envelope into my back pocket. Before she could read it, she'd been through enough already. That night, I sat awake with the letter on the table. The house silent except for the sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Winning felt different, Mole. Less like victory, more like the opening shot of a longer fight. Maybe the real lesson here is that justice doesn't end with one trial. And sometimes survival means staying louder, sharper, and harder to erase than the lies built around you. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you found that letter in your mailbox? And if you liked this one and want to support the channel, you can always hit the little thanks button below. Till then, keep your eyes open, guard your name, and don't let anyone rewrite your story. Stay safe out there, friends.
Thanks for
Watching QA stories? If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your art.